Books changed my life. I started a company called BookThinkers. We have tools and resources that readers can use to achieve more and live better. I also have a book coming out, Rise of the Reader, Strategies for Mastering Your Reading Habits and Applying What You Learn. My book is a great complement to a lot of other books out there. Our brains have the capacity to learn a new piece of information every second for like thousands of years. There's almost no way that a human brain could be full. Reading is an extremely humbling experience. The more you learn, the less you actually know. Everybody go read something.
Hello, Nick. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Pretty good, pretty good. Thank you for doing this. Whereabouts are you based, Nick?
I'm in Boston, Massachusetts, USA. So it's 8:30 p.m. over here. I'm guessing that you are in Australia.
Yes. Oh, wow. I did not know it was that late. Thank you for doing this. Damn, that's really late over there. Sorry about
Oh,
that.
well, I picked it, so don't worry about it. It's all good.
How's your week been?
It's been amazing. Yeah. It's let's see, it's Tuesday night over here, so I've already had a pretty good week so far.
That's good. That's good. Tomorrow will be the hump day for you. We're like a day ahead. Today's Wednesday, so today is our hump day.
Yeah, well, I'm talking to you from the past. You're talking to me from the future.
Thank you for doing this, Nick. So, how I first came about you was I think I was on YouTube and I was looking for some Alex Hormozy interviews or podcasts. Yeah, and then after sort of seeing your interview, then I went into your channel and then I started doing like I went into a rabbit hole watching you have a bunch of amazing people on your channel and you've interviewed amazing people and that's sort of how I found out about you, Nick.
Oh, well, amazing. Yeah, I'm happy that you reached out. YouTube is one of our smaller social channels, but we have about 150,000 on Instagram. And yeah, I'm loving to get the good word out about books.
So, Nick, could you tell me and the audience a bit about who you are, what you're currently focused on, and sort of like a quick summary? And then off that, we'll probably jump into a few different rabbit holes.
Sure. So my name is Nick Hutchison. I'm in the Boston, Massachusetts area. I'm in my late 20s and books changed my life. So back in 2017, I started a company called BookThinkers. And over the years, it's changed quite a bit. But today we have a large social media following, a podcast. We have tools and resources that readers can use to achieve more and live better. That's sort of our tagline. And I also have a book coming out November 1st. Rise of the Reader, Strategies for Mastering Your Reading Habits and Applying What You Learn. And I wrote this book, Andy, because as I grew my community, I've had literally thousands of people reach out to me in some way, shape, or form with the following question. Hey, Nick, I'm reading all of these amazing book recommendations, but I'm having a hard time implementing what I learn. And so after reading hundreds of books and trying out tons of strategies myself, I figured I could save my audience the trouble of going through that process themselves and just give them the best of what I have available to me today. And those are strategies for retention, for implementation, effective note taking, how to select the right books, and everything in between. So that's a little bit about me and what I'm focused on.
How did you go from, I guess, being like a normal sort of graduating college, going through your life, to becoming obsessed with reading, figuring out what the best type of books to read, figuring out how to read faster, figuring out retention? How did that all come into your picture?
When I graduated college, I went full time as a salesperson in a software company. And my sales director, my boss, my mentor at the time, we had a couple of local car rides for some sales deals, and he introduced me to the world of podcasting. I had never listened to a business or personal development related podcast prior to that. Nobody in my friend group was consuming that type of material. So he was really the first person that introduced me to that world. And very quickly, I started to hear the same books being referenced over and over and over again on these podcasts. Names like Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki and The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. And I thought, well, if I want to be like all of these people and they keep recommending the same books, there must be something that I don't understand about this world of nonfiction and personal development books, because I was not a reader growing up. I was more of the jock stereotype. I played football and I wrestled. I wasn't really interested in reading or school. And so I jumped into those books. I Went over one day to a local bookstore. I grabbed about 8 books and I just started reading on my lunch breaks or after work, before work. And I just became obsessed with it because in a sales role, the impact of reading books is very quantifiable. I went from selling this much and making this much to selling that much and making that much. And that much was so much more impressive. And so I wanted to do more and more and more of it. I read books on sales and marketing and communication, habits, behavior change, positive thinking. And all of those things created more money for me. So that's how I got started. I was not a reader, but I fell into it. And I think because I was working a sales job at the time, it gave me a little bit of extra motivation to get it done.
Nick, so over the last 2, 3 years of my journey of reading books, I think I've read 2 books on how to read faster because that's something that I just always struggled with. And then that, I think I went from like reading maybe, I forgot the average, but like I think the average is maybe around 70 words per minute. I have no idea, but I think I was able to sort of go from below average, let's say 50 words per minute, to sort of reading maybe 100, 120 words per minute, which is still pretty slow. I think like there's people who can read like 250, 300 words per minute. Should I find and read more sort of how to read faster, how to retain more information style books? Or should I now just go off volume and just read, practice, get better and better, and just sort of go off volume, and over time I'll get better?
I think it's important to do a little bit of both. I have read books on speed reading and books on effective reading, and those have definitely given me some tools and resources that I've applied to all of the books that I'm currently reading. But it also happens over time. You know, there's a great analogy that I like to use around golf. I've never golfed a day in my life. And so if I went out with my friends that golf all the time, I should expect to play poorly because I don't have as much experience with it. And I think reading is the same thing. I come across a lot of people who, at the beginning of their reading journey, they'll say, "Hey, I don't really read. I'm too slow. It's not useful for me." And I'll just say, well, it's a skill that you need to develop over time through repetition and trial and error. And there are so many different styles of reading. Sometimes faster is not better. Sometimes slower and more methodical reading is more effective. And so you've just got to find your style, see what works for you. And that just happens by reading a lot of books. So I think, Andy, to answer your question, yeah, it's a little bit of both. But my book that comes out here in November is more about taking what you learn and applying it directly into your life to create real behavior change, because that's the gap. Reading and not implementing is just entertainment from my perspective. But when you start to change your behavior, that's when it turns into application and knowledge and wisdom and behavior change. And that's where it becomes education, not just entertainment.
Nick, when you're reading a book, let's say the current book you're reading, what things are you doing to ensure that it's not entertainment?
I think the first thing, and this is something that almost nobody does, is you need to set a strong intention for the book that you're reading. And that intention should follow the SMART goal framework. And so you shouldn't just be reading a book because you heard it was good. You should be reading a book. We'll just use this one since it's on my desk, The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. He's a former podcast guest, really fascinating human. You shouldn't just read that. You should read that with the intention of finding 1 or 2 laws of power that you can apply into your life by the end of the month, because you constantly feel like you don't have a lot of power and you don't understand power dynamics, and that makes you upset on a daily basis. That goal is specific. You're looking for 2 laws to implement. That goal is measurable because it's quantifiable. There's 2. It's attainable. That's not a huge goal. It's written and relevant, however you want to decide that. And it's time oriented. You want to do it by the end of the month. And then adding that because at the end of your intention, spice it up, add a little bit of emotion, get vulnerable. Why are you reading this book? I'm reading this book because I constantly feel like everybody else is playing power games and I don't understand them. And that's leaving me behind and I'm not fulfilled because of it. Now, if you reread that intention every single time you open up the book, then your brain will naturally help you filter for the information that can help you achieve your goal. So you're not reading aimlessly for entertainment. You're reading with intention, a specific purpose that you can achieve and implement that excites you. And that's how you improve your life. So that's an example of something that most people aren't leveraging, the power of intention.
So I'm reading this current book It's sort of, I can't remember the name exactly, but it's sort of the reason why I read the book is I was recommended it by my old art teacher, and it sort of talks about creativity, sort of burnout, the correlation between like creative people and sort of what type of personalities they are. And I guess the intention of reading a book is I want to better understand sort of creativity bursts, the ups and downs you go through as a creative person. And that's sort of my intention, is to understand that and maybe find some sort of strategies or tools I can use in my day to day. But as I'm reading the book, it's more sort of case studies, stories, and it's educating me on what it's like to be a creative person and the ups, the downs, being introverted, this and that. So it doesn't feel like there's anything tangible that I can apply, but sort of giving me this background knowledge that maybe as I go through my life, I might pull that out at the vault of my brain. But how do I make it more forward fronting in my brain and it's not hidden at the back of the vault?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I think sometimes, to address the first part of your statement, it's okay to read a book for background knowledge. It's okay to read a book for fun and for entertainment, as long as you state that that's your intention up front so that you don't get it confused. I think there are different styles of reading. In fact, reading in general is so great for you. I mean, in a world of distraction and instant gratification, the ability to sit down and read a book and focus on it for an extended period of time, that's a skill set that you're developing. Deep work, as Cal Newport would say. And that's a differentiating skill. I mean, the average attention span is continuing to go down and down and down. And now we're consuming pieces of video content on all of these platforms, 10 pieces a minute. I mean, it's crazy. And then as far as fiction is concerned too, or books that are written maybe in a memoir format or have a lot of case studies and storytelling, you're expanding your vocabulary. You're learning new frameworks and perspectives that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And there's a lot of value to that too. As far as retention goes, if you wanted to pull that information up a little bit more frequently, I would say repetition. Repetition leads to retention. And so highlight that book, rewrite some of your favorite takeaways or your favorite case studies or notes or definitions or action items, things that interest you that you want to look up, and revisit those notes as frequently as you can in the first month, because that will help cement the neural pathway a little bit more than just passively reading the book one time, not taking any notes and trying to, think back to what you learned a couple of years ago. I mean, it is stored there, but it'll be difficult to access because that neural pathway doesn't have any repetition to support it. It's a weak connection.
Nick, are you a person that reads one book at a time, or do you read several books at a time?
I read a ton of books at a time. I think when I first started reading, I thought you had to read one book at a time. And I thought that you had to read every single word of that book cover to cover. But I don't think that's the case anymore. As I've continued to grow and explore and try new methods, what I've stuck to now is one or two physical paper books at a time, one audio book, and one ebook. So I'll consume different pieces of information at different times of the day or in different circumstances. And what I really enjoy about switching it up and reading multiple books at the same time is, number one, you won't become too fatigued to the information that you're reading. Maybe you'll get one major takeaway from the physical book you're reading and you need to take a couple days to digest and reflect on it. So you'll switch over to a different topic. And I like to call this concept book sex, but you could take an idea from one book and combine it with an idea from a completely unrelated book and create something novel. And that's something that I try to do regularly. So, for example, let's say you're reading a book on fasting, intermittent fasting, and you're reading a book on management theory. Well, how can you combine those two and create something new and novel and fun and try it out? Can you have an intermittent management style where you only lead your team once a week or for a couple hours a day and you force them to consolidate everything into one message per day? I mean, you just take these random concepts and you try to mash them together. And I think that's one of the major benefits to reading multiple books at the same time.
Nick, how do you highlight, take notes, review previous notes or previous books you've read, all at the same time, multiply that by 4 books that you're reading at the same time, multiply by 4 books that you completed recently. Are you taking notes and sort of squeezing the lemon of every single book you're reading, or do you only implement that on certain books?
Nowadays, I only implement that on certain books. And also for your audience, I'll throw out a reminder that I read and implement books as a full-time job. BookThinkers is my business and I get paid to review books. So it's a little bit of a cheat code. I don't expect everybody else to read a few books a week. But I'll say that the very first book that I deeply highlighted was Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. And I remember I rewrote every single thing that I highlighted from that book into an Evernote document on my computer. And I had over 200 takeaways. Now, that's not realistic to review every single day amongst all the other books that I was also reading and reviewing, right? So that was the first time that I started to think about concepts like the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule. What 20% of my takeaways have the potential to create 80% of the change that was related to my original intention? Because everything else might be useful, but it's fluff. It's not as important. We don't have the capacity to review our notes from 100 books a day, especially if we have 200 takeaways from every single one of them. And so I started to really look at that specific intention, only take notes related to fulfilling my goal in that intention, and everything else, it might have been fun, it might have been useful, but I try to shed that. Like I try not to pay too much attention to it. And that's drastically reduced the number of items that I'm highlighting and paying attention to. And it also increases my likelihood of reviewing that information on a regular basis, whether it's in flashcards or rereading the highlights in each book or an Evernote document, because there's not as much information to filter through. And each takeaway is intensified because it's emotional for me.
Nick, do you have a sort of purpose and why with book thinkers? And is that the main thing where every single book you read, you try to implement and apply what you've learned to that main thing and main purpose?
It is. It has become the main thing over the years. I read a good book a couple of years ago called Built to Serve by Evan Carmichael. And in that book, Evan helps you articulate your purpose with a framework that he calls who, why, how. So your who is your one word. It's who you are. And for me, that's progress. When I make progress in my health, my wealth, my happiness on a daily basis, when I lay my head down to sleep, I sleep like a baby. I know that I'm motivated by progress. And I found out along this journey that I'm also motivated by helping other people make progress. And that's a form of impact that really fulfills me. Progress in their health, wealth, and happiness. So who, why, how? Why? Well, I went from a very insecure and also a very ego-driven person in my late teens and early 20s to somebody who was completely focused on impact, was totally fulfilled, not insecure anymore. And that transition happened because of books. So if I can help other people make dramatic changes in their lives by recommending the right books that help them make progress, that makes me fulfilled. So who, why, and then how. The how is sort of interchangeable. Today it's Book Thinkers. It's also this book that I'm launching in November. It's also everything else that Book Thinkers has in its ecosystem. So yeah, I'm reading and applying most of these books to either my personal relationships, myself, and my relationship to myself and my body, or my business. Those are kind of the three main categories.
As a really curious person and you're constantly wanting to just learn more and sort of just, absorb information, how do you make sure that, you're not learning new information and then the things that you've learned 5 years ago is being erased? So you're sort of effectively just sort of, it's not growing, it's just sort of moving.
Sure. Well, I think having organized notes so that you can go back and revisit things that you've read prior to 5 years ago and refresh those neural pathways is important. So like I said, making sure that you take notes or highlight, rewrite those notes, etc. And the book covers a ton of different ways to do that. The other thing that I'd say to everybody listening today, Andy, is that our brains have the capacity to learn a new piece of information every second for like thousands of years. I don't remember the exact period of time, but there's almost no way that a human brain could be full. Like we have enough space to learn something almost forever, for thousands of years. And so it will always be retained at some sort of subconscious level. You just need to review that information regularly if you truly want to retain that information. One of my mentors, his name is Kevin Horsley. He wrote a book called Unlimited Memory. He memorized the first 10,000 digits of pi, which is pretty incredible. And he participated in this competition where somebody would say, what's digit number 7,221? And the 5 digits after it, and he'd have to know those digits. And so it just shows like what our human brains are capable of doing once you apply a little bit of intention to what you're reading, you make it emotional, you filter for just that type of information, take notes, review those notes repeatedly. And in that scenario, I can remember things from books I've read much longer than 5 years ago now. Even though I've read 500 books, I can still tell you something from almost every single one that I've read where I followed that framework.
Nick, do you have a process or system or like a catalyst that sort of gets you to reread certain books or review certain notes for certain books, and then sort of balancing that against just consuming new content? Like, how do you figure out that balance? Is there a formula? Is there a system?
I tried to build a system at one point and I wasn't very successful with it, but the system would kind of work like this. There's a concept called the forgetting curve. And it states that on day one, when you read a piece of information, the likelihood that you can remember it and spit it back out is about 80%. And each day that you go without reviewing that information, it consistently goes down. So the likelihood that you've retained it goes down. But as you reread that information, the curve, it doesn't slope down as much. It starts to even out a little bit. So after you've reviewed something like 30 times in the first 30 days, now you can move that review back to once a week. Then you can move that review back to once a month, then once a quarter, and then yearly. And you'll still be able to access that information because you're consistently going back down that neural pathway and rebuilding it. So I tried to build a system like that where every single book that I would read would default into that schedule. And I just didn't keep up with it. I got busy. It wasn't fully automated. And I'd like to rebuild something like that for myself one day. So today, where I sit, I reread some of my favorite books every single year, the books that have had the biggest impact on me. And what's funny about rereading books like that is every time I read them with a new perspective and from a new perspective, it's almost like reading a new book again. I'll read a book for the 5th, 6th, 7th time and find something completely new and different and novel about it. And I think that's amazing. And I try to do that as often as possible. Today, I sit on the side of consuming more new information than reviewing old information because I think sometimes what gets you here doesn't always get you there, especially in business. But yeah, there's some great books out there.
What's your thoughts on reading 100 new books versus reading 50 new books and taking the top, say, 10 and reading them 5 times each? So that's 100 reads, but it's only 50 new books.
Yeah, I think that second scenario would probably be more effective. I think it's popular now on social media. Like you brought up Hormozy before. You'll hear Hormozy say it's better to read one book 100 times than read 100 books. I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, from a financial perspective, he's clearly winning. But it depends on what your goals are. I think for the right person, there's room to do both by replacing low impact activities like Netflix and social media with constructive activities like reading a great book. And if I had to choose one or the other, though, I'd say read 50 books and then pick the top 5 or 10 and reread those 5 times each. Yeah, that's probably a more effective strategy. It's hard to improve 50 areas of your life in a year. You know what I mean?
That's true. Nick, how many books do you have that you reread yearly? And then how did you go about finding those books?
I read about 100 books a year. And depending on the year, anywhere between 10 to 20 of those books I'm rereading, sometimes multiple times in the same year, especially if I find something that's very applicable to a problem that I'm currently facing. And how do I find those books? They come from all sorts of places. I am paid to read a lot of books. Sometimes they're books that I wouldn't necessarily have chosen to read in the first place, but I find something extremely interesting and valuable in them. And so I'm happy that I ended up reading them in the first place. I've read all the, most of the major business classics, personal development classics, just so that I can reference them as a point of conversation. And I find that if something is famous, it's famous for a reason, especially if it's an older book, something like The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People that's been around for a long time, or Man's Search for Meaning, or The Alchemist. I think those books are classics because they're very important and they apply to a lot of people and they're easy to implement and understand. I definitely get book recommendations from the authors that I connect with. On our podcast, I've interviewed a lot of really interesting people, like I know you have too. Entrepreneurs like Alex Hormozy and Grant Cardone and Robin Sharma and Robert Greene, Ryan Holiday. And I always ask them for book recommendations or look in the back of their books for book recommendations. And then, of course, being in the social media book world, I see a lot of books. And so stuff always catches my attention. I'll say for a new reader, somebody who's kind of just starting out their journey and they're not really sure where to get their book recommendations from, there's sort of two places to start. Number one, I would read books about your heroes. Most of our heroes, especially entrepreneurship icons and famous people, athletes, etc., they have books either written about them or they've written books. And it's a great place to start because you're familiar with the content, you're energized and interested in that person already. And oftentimes those biographies or autobiographies, they read like a movie. And so they're easier to get through. The other place I'd recommend starting is to say, where are you right now? And where would you like to be by the end of the year? And what's the biggest difference? What do you have to do to close that gap? What's preventing you to get there? And do a little bit of reflection on that. And if you'd like to earn more money, like most of us do, understand what are your bottlenecks? Why aren't you earning more money? Is it because you're an employee and you want to start a business? Well, you've got to read business books. And so once you start to identify that gap and you identify what the bottlenecks are, what's holding you back, you'll be a little bit more emotionally tied to whatever book you find as the right solution. You can go on Amazon, you can go on Bookstagram or Book Talk or YouTube and ask some of your favorite influencers and you'll get some good answers.
Nick, so let's say I have a topic that I want to sort of improve on. Let's say it's energy management. I want to sort of be more consistent. I want to sort of understand, be more self-aware and sort of feel like I have more control on the ups and downs throughout the week, throughout the months, throughout the year. What's the best process of finding the best books on this problem that I'm going through?
I always default to asking people that I'd like to be like. What resources do you have available or that are modeling the behavior that you'd like to model? So if energy management is the problem that you'd like to solve, do a little reflection on the people around you. Who's managing their energy well? And what resources have they studied to achieve the lifestyle that they're currently living that you'd like to live as well? And I would also encourage people to reach out to social media personalities, maybe that they only follow on Instagram or on Facebook or on YouTube. Because I've found, and Andy, I'm not sure if you found this as well, that a lot of these authors are far more accessible than you think they are. A lot of these business celebrities, YouTubers, Instagrammers, they're far more accessible than you think they'd be. I know that as my audience has continued to grow, I actually get fewer inquiries than I used to. And I believe that's because people think the perceived likelihood that I'm going to answer is lower, therefore they hold their questions. And so reach out to your favorite people that you want to model their behavior and ask them, what resources did they study? Now, if you don't have anybody that comes to mind in energy management that you want to be like, just go to Google and search, best energy management books and see what pops up. Start to read the reviews. I think you'll hear a lot of people tell you that the gold is in the 3 and 4 star reviews. Those are people who don't just click 5 for the sake of clicking 5, and they're not emotionally triggered to put a 1 or a 2 for some reason. And you'll get good constructive feedback from those types of reviews. I know for me, just as a point of reference, like you can always DM BookThinkers on Instagram and say, hey, I'd like to improve my energy management and be more consistent. What are some of your favorite books to help solve that problem? And I would reply maybe with a follow-up question or two, or I would just go right into some of my favorites, such as Essentialism by Greg McKeown. That book teaches you to do more with less. focus on higher impact activities, ditch the lower impact activities, automate, delegate, eliminate, Tim Ferriss style. Then I would ask you to read that book and come back and tell me, what were some of your favorite takeaways? Have you successfully implemented them? What was missing? Was it aligned with your expectations? And try to go from there. Really narrow in on what can solve the problem that you have.
Nick, what's your thoughts on AI? Because like I have like an education company, and as you sort of gain more data, read more books, put more things into your catalog of information, and as you get to know your customers more, you can get more and more aligned and give more and more customized book recommendations. Yeah, what's your thoughts on AI?
I find it fascinating. I would say I'm an AI optimist. It's definitely not a specialty of mine or something that I've read very much about. Um, but yeah, I think AI is going to bring a lot of beauty to this world. It will continue to do that. I actually had somebody the other day talking to me about AI chatbots that will be able to read every article an author's ever written, every book, consume every podcast, and you'll be able to ask questions for free to your favorite authors and get very specific guided answers. And that's just one adaptation of learning that I think is really cool. I think as far as it relates to the book industry, we will see, I mean, the barrier to entry for writing a book has already gone down because of Amazon and their KDP platform. Anybody can be an author tomorrow if they want to be, with a book available on Amazon and have it drop shipped. But now with platforms like ChatGPT, I think there will be a lot of AI written books, and I think it'll be more and more important to be a human than ever as far as authors are concerned, because humans are able to change their minds over time and write new content, adopt new perspectives, that type of thing. But anyway, yeah, I would say I'm an AI optimist. What about you?
I think I'm similar. I feel like AI is going to be able to level, it's going to be similar to the internet, where the internet sort of just leveled the playing field. And with AI, it's just going to level it even more. Like, I have no technical knowledge in developing, but I've been playing around with ChatGPT and it's helped me build different bots, different scripts with zero knowledge. And I've basically been able to close the gap between someone who has, 5-10 years of development knowledge within a period of 2 or 3 weeks. So I think AI is just going to constantly level the playing field. Yeah, that's sort of my thoughts so far. Like, I feel like the world of Wall-E is possible, the world where there's so much value being created, so much output being made, where that no one has to work. Like, that's probably going to eventually happen, because AI just levels the playing field, outputs so much value in such a short amount of time.
Yeah, it's really interesting. One of my favorite authors, his name is Ken Rusk. He wrote a book called Blue Collar Cash. He is a big advocate for the trades, people who use their hands to make a living. Think plumbers, think electricians, think people who are very skilled in a specific discipline. And going back a number of years, we thought that the AI revolution was going to be more robotic in nature, that blue collar jobs like flipping burgers would be eliminated. Nobody would mow their own lawns. But what's very interesting about what's happened recently is that it's the white collar stuff, like you just talked about, programming, where the cost for those skill sets is going to plummet and everybody has access to them. I mean, just like you, I have no computer science background, but I'm able to leverage ChatGPT, an artificially intelligent language learning platform, and I'm able to use it in my business, play around with it every single day, and it feels natural and it's easy. So yeah, I'm optimistic as far as learning is concerned. And there's something else that's kind of slightly tied to this, so I'll just make quick mention of it. I think that sometimes when we learn through a platform like ChatGPT, we're getting a summarized version of what could be learned in a book. Like, for instance, if you just read, hey, ChatGPT, write a summary of the 48 laws of power for me. Yeah, you can read that summary, but you're far less likely to take action and change your life on a summary than you are on reading an entire book with all of the case studies, searching to fulfill the intention that you originally set for the book. So I think there will be a place for long form written content for a long time, just because we're able to subconsciously internalize it so much more because it's longer form,
Given that in the future, people would be able to just literally just talk to an AI and basically talk to, say, Robert Greene, there's already things like Spark Notes, which sort of summarize books, and AI is just going to do that better. What's the long-term vision with book thinkers, given that that's going to happen?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm somebody who always has a 5-year game plan, but it's sort of written in pencil because it's always changing. Today, with Book Thinkers as a business, we have 8 people on our team now, and most of our revenue comes from short form video production. So we'll actually fly out to an author and help them turn their physical book into 50 to 100 pieces of short form content for Instagram Reels, for TikTok, for YouTube Shorts. And we work with a lot of authors that have complementary products and services like coaching, consulting, speaking, courses, things of that nature. And we're in that sort of like, that didn't exist a few years ago. And so I had to adapt and change our model. I mean, when I first started, Andy, I was doing 12-minute book reviews on YouTube. And then content became shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. And now some of our content is 15 seconds long. And so, yeah, I enjoy how fast things are changing. I hope we start to trend back towards longer form content. But yeah, just introducing people to books that can change a specific problem in their life. Like, I think in some way, shape, or form, that'll always be at the core of who I am and what I do.
Nick, how did you go about getting so many amazing people on your podcast? And I guess the second question that I'll follow up afterwards is that then does that tie into book thinkers, meeting these people? And then I think they probably need sort of clips and short form content. And then does that all connect together?
Yeah, it does all connect together. The podcast was started before that service was available. And it was started because I wanted to be mentored by my favorite authors. I had follow-up questions. I wanted to get to know these people. They were my heroes. I thought, okay, let's start a podcast. I like listening to podcasts. This will be a fun way for my community to be able to sort of interact with some of these famous authors. And so my very first interview was Evan Carmichael, and who wrote Built to Serve, which I mentioned before. And Evan had become a good friend and a mentor of mine. And Evan told me after we were done recording, he said, hey, use my name anywhere you want. He said, it might mean nothing to some people, but it might mean everything to other people. The fact that I gave you my time, which is worth a lot of money, might help somebody else bypass the due diligence process and say, oh, if Evan recorded with him, well, I can too, because I'm friends with Evan and I know he values his time. If Evan thought it was worth it, I think it's worth it as well. And so I started to borrow the credibility of the guests that I'd have on. And what's great about Instagram as a platform is you can click on who somebody follows and it will show the people that you also follow right up top. So I was following everybody that I was interviewing, and I was looking for those points of familiarity when I would reach out to the next author, to the next author. And so I think episode number 9 or something like that was Grant Cardone. And once Grant was on our podcast, from there, everybody else said yes, because Grant's time is worth $100,000 an hour. And so if Grant said yes, everybody else can say yes too. And so, yeah, that's kind of how it started and how it started to build. And as I developed relationships with these authors, a lot of them have become clients of ours for sure. And we use the podcast as a lead mechanism. We'll have a conversation with them on the show about how they effectively market their books. Do you create any video content? What's that process like for you? And then we'll follow up after the show and say, hey, we actually provide this as a service. The other way that it's positively impacted revenue and helped us grow so much is that we just leverage their credibility from a social perspective. And so when you go on our Instagram, you see me with Alex Hormozy and Lewis Howes and Grant Cardone. And that just creates a level of credibility that the other, maybe we'll call them video production people, don't have, short form agencies. And although we didn't do Grant's content, we're still hanging out with Grant. He's been on our podcast. It creates a different, a different air. You know what I mean? So yeah, we've definitely borrowed that credibility a little bit to do business with people and to continue to grow our business and expand, and also just learn, people like that can teach you so much. Like we were talking about Alex Hormozy before. We just had him on our podcast a few months ago. That episode did very well for us, but it was different and it was new and it was fun. And we asked genuine questions that we wanted to know the answers to.
That's amazing. Nick, what's your thoughts on in-person versus virtual sort of podcasts? So like being down under, being in Australia, it's hard for me to do in person. Now, even if I went down that route, I think my volume and consistency would also be much lower. Like with these virtual sort of podcasts, I have a backlog of 5, 6 episodes at any given time. And I'm thinking like, man, it would be so much harder to do that in person. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, we do. I would say about 80% of our podcasts are done virtually, and only about 20% are done in person. It's more expensive to record podcasts in person as well, which is another factor. And I wouldn't necessarily say that it increases the quality very much. The main benefit for us for flying out to the A-listers and recording our podcast with them in person is that you could take photos with them, you can get behind the scenes footage, you can borrow their credibility. Like I was saying before, trust is transitive. And so if you see me hanging out with Lewis House, well, if you trust Lewis and Lewis trusts me, you can bypass that due diligence and trust me, you're much more likely to do so. So we try to engineer some of those situations when we have a guest to the podcast and we know that they can bring a lot of impact in terms of audience size or assumed credibility to the table. We'll spend a little bit of money and go make that happen. Plus, it's great to develop relationships with people in person. Oftentimes when we record in person, it's, hey, you want to go get lunch after, you want to go get dinner after, or we show up before and hang out or hang out afterwards. And that's where the business happens. You know, it happens in the conversations that aren't necessarily being filmed. Like you said, though, for the sake of convenience, time zones, travel, flexibility on people's schedules, and also their comfort sometimes, it's easier to do it via Zoom.
I love your talk about credibility. And like, I feel like with our pod, we've gotten some amazing, cool guests, and we have like a high amount of credibility, and that helps us get new guests. But our reach is sort of lagging much further behind. What's your advice on sort of getting your reach up? Like we create clips, and the clips might get 1,000, 2,000 views. We'll post one a day. Sometimes one in every 60 clips might go viral and get 100,000 views. But even the one that got 100,000 views, that might only bring in an extra 10, 20, 50 followers to, you know, our podcast Instagram page. What's your advice there?
Well, I don't know that I've really figured that piece out yet either. We face some of the same problems that you do. I think because we're using the podcast as a lead mechanism to do business unrelated to reach, that sort of helps us a little bit. And, you know, in the early days when I was prospecting guests, like the big names, I never mentioned our downloads, and nobody ever asked for them either, because they were only looking at the other guests that we had on. And so I think you do a pretty good job at that. Actually, I saw, you know, obviously I received an email from your team and saw the names that you had on your podcast, and I didn't respond and say, well, how many downloads should I expect? Or are you going to repurpose this content into social media? I just said yes, because those people said yes. You know what I mean? So playing a little bit of that same game. If you can find a way to do business outside of the podcast with the people that you feature, or because of the people that you feature, I think it becomes less important to grow the number of downloads.
Nick, do you have
I don't know. Maybe that's just a justification that I have for our lack of downloads too.
Yeah, I think I'm in the exact same boat, and my sort of optimism is like, you know, the lag will eventually catch up, and if I'm just consistent with it over a period of 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years, then it's gonna catch up, and it's just a long game.
I think the same thing.
Nick, do you have a process of sort of building a relationship and sort of continuing that conversation with all these different podcast guests after the podcast? And do you find that, you know, for me, maybe 1 in every 10 guests, we really sort of mesh, and the other 9 out of 10 were cool and we still chat here and there? What's your relationship been like with your podcast guests?
I went through a podcast mastermind with an excellent guy named Lou Diamond. Lou has a podcast called Thrive Loud. And I think his call to action when we connected about this was that he had done $1 million in revenue related to his podcast in the last 12 months. And it wasn't because of A-list guests. In fact, it was the exact opposite. He was only interviewing people who were a good fit for his business services, his affiliates, everything else that he had in his system. And only about 10% of his guests were the big name. Because maybe this isn't his exact language, but when you scroll through a potential podcast, like if I want to be on a podcast, somebody reaches out to me and I go look at their last 10 guests. If I recognize anybody in the last 10 guests, that's good enough for me. I don't need to recognize every single name. The other 9 can be people who are an ideal fit for you and your vibe and what you're doing outside of the podcast, and maybe a little bit more younger, people with similar interests. And I think you'll find a little bit more success in building those relationships if you start to target people who aren't necessarily celebrities. And that's what I learned too. We have about 125 episodes live or something like that. And the first 50 were all celebrity authors. They all had to sell tens of thousands to tens of millions of books. They all had to be social media famous. They all had to carry some weight, be verified before you could pay for it. I just had this idea that everyone needed to be famous, but that didn't drive downloads or business. And so now that I went through Lou's program, I realized that I needed to prospect guests that would be a better fit for me, my current mission, people who wanted to grow with me, and only sprinkle in some of the famous people every so often. One of the things that he also taught me was before you hang up, after you stop recording, schedule a second call. And so, like I mentioned to you before, I might ask an author in today's podcasting environment halfway through the interview, okay, so Andy, you had a successful book launch. You're gaining a lot of traction. What role did short form video play in the success that you've seen so far, both on social media and with your book launch? And they might go, well, actually, I don't create any short form video. And I'm like, what? What do you mean you don't create any? We should have a conversation about that after. And then the podcast ends, recording stops. And I might say, hey, remember how I said I wanted to talk to you about short form content? Can we connect on that next week? How's your Wednesday looking? And I schedule that follow-up conversation. And only then do I go into a discovery call. And if it's a good fit, maybe make a pitch and extend that relationship. Or they might be a good fit for something else that I have in my environment. So I know this is a long answer, but hopefully it's helpful. BookThinkers is hosting an event for the first time ever this September. And it's on the front side of the Lewis House Summit of Greatness. And I've invited a lot of my author connections to that event with no intention other than furthering that relationship in person, like you had mentioned. And I understand that's difficult being in Australia, but that is an opportunity not to have that one-on-one experience where I have to go pay to fly out to one person, but I'm paying to fly out to see 30 or 40 of my existing clients or prospective clients and build a relationship with everybody, build a community, get a good feel to it. And I think that's how sometimes it happens too.
That's beautiful. Nick, what's your plan for your book launch? Are you sort of going to reach out to a bunch of different podcasts and sort of do a bunch of 1-hour podcasts? Are you going to reach out to previous sort of guests that you've had on and see if you can do something with them? Since you've read and sort of been on the behind the scenes of so many other people's book launch, what are you going to take away and use for your own book launch?
Oh, we have so much going on. A couple of big flashy projects. So number one, I want 100 nonfiction book Instagram accounts to post about my new book during my launch week. I want 100 podcast interviews to go live during my launch month, which is November. I want to do a pre-order home library giveaway. That'll be reserved just for US followers and pre-orders. But we're going to give away 500 books, as well as bookshelves, a desk, reading chair, etc. I'm going to offer existing clients of mine as well as prospective clients. Basically, a deal where they can get some of our book promotion services in exchange for bulk pre-ordering a number of books, anywhere between 25 and 50, depending on what services they'd like. And I'm also well, there's a lot of additional strategies, but the final one that I'll mention is that my book is a great complement to a lot of other books out there. Because if you read it in tandem or right before another big book, you can leverage my book to get more out of the other one that you're going to read. So I'm going to find a better way to articulate that, because that was a bunch of words, but I'm going to offer collab opportunities with tons of my favorite authors, where both of our books will be pictured in the same image, and it'll be a collab post on Instagram between both accounts, highlighting my favorite takeaways from their book, what my intention was, how I effectively implemented it, etc. Something that's mutually beneficial, and hopefully have a couple of those go live every single day during my launch month as well. So those are some of the strategies that I'm implementing.
That's so cool, Nick. Thanks for sharing that. Nick, with the 100 Instagram pages, how do you go about finding the 100? Will it be paid posts? Or like what's the best way to go about doing an Instagram promotion blast?
Well, I've been in the space for so long, and BookThinkers is one of the biggest US-based bookstagram accounts, and we've definitely collabed with the most celebrities. So a lot of other accounts will just be interested in supporting, just because a lot of people started their accounts because of BookThinkers. A lot of people have collabed with me over the years. We've been a resource for a lot of other bookstagram pages on how to effectively monetize, how to communicate and close deals with authors, things like that. So I just have a Rolodex of Instagram relationships that I'm leveraging. And if I was not in the space and I was looking to do something like that, it would be very expensive. You know, pages charge anywhere between thousands of dollars to as little as maybe hundreds of dollars per post if you're looking for an effective, good, solid review. So get into the space, build relationships before you need them. That's probably one of the keys there as well.
Nick, when you jump on a podcast with these cool guests, what's your process of asking questions? Do you have a framework? Sort of what's top of mind? What's your intention coming into the podcast?
Well, when I first started, I would read. So every one of our guests is an author. And so I'd read their book cover to cover. I'd come up with a bunch of great questions. Before recording, I would always ask authors, is there anything that you'd like to focus on today? Anything that most podcasters skip over, forget to ask, never highlight, or something that's top of mind? And sometimes they'll give me a good answer. Then I'll always ask people, is there anything that's off limits? And typically people say no, but every once in a while you get somebody that says yes. Then I would go into questions about their book, layup after layup after layup. And I did that for a long time because it created a bunch of sound bites that I could repurpose. It was an easy conversation. I wanted these celebrities to like me, but it wasn't as self-serving as I wanted it to be. Like, I wanted these to be mentoring sessions, but I was really just doing book promotion. So then I started to ask things that I was curious about. And so, for instance, when I read The 48 Laws of Power, I asked Robert Greene a bunch of questions like, did you leverage these laws when writing and launching this book? And which ones did you leverage? Trying to get a good answer out of them about, oh yeah, I always said less than what was necessary on podcasts or whatever the case is. And then from there, I just went totally off the rails. Now I don't do any preparation. I mean, I might read a few paragraphs of a book here or there. If I'm reading a celebrity's book, I'll read the whole book, but I'll just follow my curiosity. I'll ask what's on my mind. I'll take suggestions right before we film. And I think that's turning into better conversations. I talked to an author recently, Chris Smith, author of The Conversion Code. And like 2 minutes in, he mentioned during his morning routine that because he's bipolar, and then he went on and said something about that. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that you were bipolar. What's that like, running a $10 million marketing business as a bipolar person? And then we talked about mental health for an hour, and we didn't even talk about his book. And that was a much better conversation. And it was more unique than everything else that he was doing, because in the past, I would have just skipped over that remark. I wouldn't have followed my curiosity. And Yeah. Anyway, now it's a little bit more authentic.
Nick, what's your thoughts on reaching out to previous podcast guests and asking for referrals of other guests? Like, I've always avoided that because it feels like, that's a straightaway ask, and I don't really want to ask. And I could just play the long game, take it slow and steady, and slowly get the guests I want. But at the same time, it might be a wasted opportunity to get the guests I want at a much faster pace. What's your thoughts on that? I haven't sort of done that yet.
I haven't really done that either. I've made a few attempts that were more like home run attempts or grand slam attempts. Like I remember one time I asked Rolf Potts, who wrote a book called Vagabonding. I said, "Hey, Rolf, can you introduce me to Tim Ferriss?" And I provided a reason why, because Tim wrote the foreword to Rolf's book. And of course, he didn't answer me. So I probably pushed him out of my network by asking for that referral. I haven't really done that much. Now, I think in the world of sales and business, it's very important to ask for referrals. I think a customer can sell 10 times better than your best sales rep. But as far as podcasting goes, these are very delicate, intricate relationships. And oftentimes people aren't willing to make those referrals. I mean, people, you would not be, I mean, maybe you wouldn't be very surprised, but people ask me all the time for introductions to people that I barely have a relationship with. I might have interviewed them once. Maybe we collabed on a few Instagram posts, but I'm not ready to make an introduction. Those people get introduction requests all day long, every day.
I recently had a previous podcast guest ask for an introduction to another guest I had on, and I sort of knew that I didn't have that strong of a relationship yet, but I didn't want to say no to this person who sort of took time to come on my show. So I sort of put together introduction. I didn't get a response on the Instagram group chat, but I got a reply from his assistant in the email chain. So I did 2 introductions. I felt like I didn't want to say no to that person asking, but at the same time, I didn't want to bother this person that I didn't have a strong enough relationship with to do the introduction. So I was in this weird sort of situation, and I don't know in the future if I should decline, but that person came on my podcast when I asked him. So like, what's your advice there, or have you been in a similar situation?
I like to tell people that I'm happy to make an introduction if I feel like it's appropriate, but I'm not willing to make an introduction if I don't have a strong enough relationship or I feel like the two people aren't aligned. And I tell that to everybody. Most of the time people say, "Hey, can I ask you for a referral?" And I'll just say that right off the bat. And then they either won't make the request or they do. And I say, "Hey, I'm sorry, but I'm just not comfortable making that request at this time. The relationship isn't as tight as maybe it looks as over social media or whatever the case is." Yeah, I would say, although it's tough, probably decline it right off the bat next time, unless you feel strongly about it.
That's good advice. Nick, do you have any advice for sort of energy management when it comes to podcasting? Like I love doing the podcast. I'm super curious. I have so much fun. But usually afterwards, I am a bit more tired. I have lunch and then like I'm knocked out for the rest of the day. Do you find the same, or could you have a podcast in the morning and still go through your day as if it was like you didn't have that podcast?
It changes over time. When I first started the podcast, I was thrilled to death every time I interviewed one of these author celebrities. And then over time, but I was running a smaller business, so I was also doing all of the editing, uploading, distribution, cover art, etc. And then as it started to grow and I became less interested in the guests sometimes that I was interviewing, that also means that it was more of a drag to edit and distribute. So I found a way to outsource it. And even though I was outsourcing it, I still wasn't loving the conversations. And in fact, I even had a period of time, maybe at the beginning of this year, where I thought, we're getting close to episode number 100. Maybe I stopped the podcast because it wasn't directly tied to any major revenue anymore. I already had borrowed the credibility from the people that I was looking to borrow credibility from. It was fully outsourced, but the conversations, they were a little bit draining, like you were talking about. And so I needed to find a new reason to continue with these interviews. So I did a couple of things. Number one, I brought on a co-host. So I now have a co-host on my podcast. He does a lot of the prep sometimes. He handles a lot of the questions sometimes. And sometimes we'll just follow his curiosity. We may even get to the point where he hosts podcasts by himself without me involved. The other thing was I went through that podcast mastermind class thing with Lou Diamond, and he helped me realize that, yeah, it's exciting to interview business celebrities, but that doesn't generate money. And I'm at a period of business growth where we've grown about 5 times bigger in the last 18 months from a monthly revenue perspective. And money is on my mind. It's what I care about. It's what enables me to scale and grow my team and grow my impact. And so I needed a way to monetize the podcast more effectively, not through ads, but by interviewing people that I could do business with. And that brought more life into the show for sure.
Nick, how did you turn BookThinkers into, your Instagram pages, a lot of book reviews, book related content, and sort of use that and sort of have people know that you help people create clips, and then sort of have the credibility of authors you have on BookThinkers for book reviewing sort of related content, and sort of tie that back into clips, which is a bit different?
Great question. I'll give you just a brief history of how we got to where we are today as far as the business goes. So when I started sharing the books that I was reading on social media, I had little to no intention other than connecting with like-minded people and as a way to rewrite my favorite takeaways from the books I was reading. Once that audience started to grow and I started to connect with more like-minded people, now I was posting for that dopamine hit, for the likes and the comments and people DMing me that a book changed their life and the impact and the whole 9 yards. And I had a couple of attempts at monetizing that attention that were unsuccessful. But what happened naturally from building the audience was that I had a few authors start to reach out to me. And at first they would say, hey, I'd love to send you a copy of my book for free so that you can review it for your audience. And I thought, oh, wow, I'm spending money on books. Now I'm getting books for free. That's a step in the right direction. And then from there, authors started to say, hey, how much do you charge for a book review? Charge for a book review? I can get paid to read? That's amazing. Meanwhile, I'm working full time at a software sales job. So now I'm getting paid to read. And each time I would read a book, review it, post about it, I would always ask these authors, hey, is there anything else I can help with? And over the years, I've done a lot of very interesting things related to book marketing and promotion that didn't work. But a few things did work. So I started to build this business up a little bit more. We did a little bit of podcast booking, some book reviews, some other miscellaneous services. We tried some masterminds, things of that nature. And then I read $100 Million Offers by Alex Hormozy. And Alex said in the beginning of that book that 20% of your customers are willing to pay 5 times more. Like, okay, if that's true, what service could I offer that's 5 times more? And I went through all the frameworks in Alex's book, talking about implementation. I went through everything. And one of the exercises was to map out every single idea that you can possibly come up with to solve your target customer's biggest problems. And I was like, well, people have been renting space on my pages forever. They don't have an audience, so they pay me to review their book for my audience. But I was like, what if I could help authors create their own audience? That's a bigger lift. I know it has to happen through video content. And short form content today follows the same structure: strong hook, plus some credibility, value, and maybe a call to action. It's like, what would it take to fly out and film with an author? So I priced it out. And of course, it was 5 times bigger than my existing biggest offer. And so I went to a number of my existing customers on the book review side of things. We did a little bit of social media management, like some other things, like I said. I said, hey, are you interested in creating any video content? It's the fastest way to grow your platform. It's the fastest way to build trust. And you can start to sell some of these other complementary products and services you have. And the very first guy that I talked to, his name was Rajiv Kapoor, author of Chase Greatness. He said, Nick, I literally had this exact service written on a napkin with the note, call Nick, under it. Because I figured if anybody's going to help me create video content about my book, maybe it's you, because you put video content out every day. I'm like, all right, I'm on to something. And I started selling it more and more and more and iterating and iterating and iterating and improving it and improving it. And then brought on a second team to continue filming and a full-time video editor, the whole 9 yards. And as far as, so that's kind of how that service came to be. Short form content took off. Authors need a way to spice things up around their book launch. Their ROI comes from the complementary products and services that they provide as it relates to the book. Bang, bang. But your question about how to leverage the credibility of these other people, what I did was I would include a podcast. This is the basic version of it, but I would include a podcast interview in that service offering. And I would say something like, hey, Andy, I see that you follow Grant Cardone, Patrick Bet-David, and Dan Bilzerian. They've all been guests on my show. And so we'll also interview you for our podcast, and you'll share the digital stage with those guys. It'll just be a fun experience. And so it's a way to kind of slide in the credibility. No, I didn't do video content for them, but their names are being used in the conversation. And people get excited about that. Oh, going on the same podcast that XYZ was on, that's my favorite author. And again, I'm always looking at who they follow on Instagram. So I hope that helps. That was a very long answer, but that's kind of how I do it.
I love that, Nick. Nick, given your current goal and your current business, what was the catalyst and goal for the book that you've written and releasing?
Yeah, it's just because I receive that same question so often. Hey, Nick, I'm reading all of these books. I get super energized by them, but I have a hard time implementing them. What's missing? And I want to help solve that problem. I mean, books have done so much for me, and I know that the right book at the right time can change somebody's life forever. And it bums me out when somebody reads a book that I recommend, and because they don't have the right tools or the right frameworks to implement the book effectively, it falls flat. It doesn't solve their problem. And that bums me out. Like, it really does. So I want to solve that problem. And I also want to use all of the services that BookThinkers provides to our author clients on myself to see what sort of splash that I can make as just an additional testimonial, but also to go through that experience, relate to my clientele a little bit more. You know, if I was teaching you how to be a chef, but I've never been a chef before, you'd be like, why would I want to learn from you? So I think that extra data point that I've successfully released a self-published book, which is the hardest thing to do. I could have gone out and worked with a traditional publisher, but I really want to work like the hardest angle of what my clients go through. And yeah, it's been tough, but I'm very excited to see how it performs so that I can go serve my clients better too.
I love that. Nick, how do you balance these sort of book implementation, sort of book reading sort of brand and sort of book thinkers, and then sort of balance that against the agency and sort of the clips? Like, both are basically full-time businesses. Like, how do you balance and sort of juggle both? Any advice there?
Yes, outsource, make yourself irrelevant. That's what I've continued to do. Instead of pulling money out of the business, I reinvest by bringing people on that can replace things that I was doing. You know, I've played every single role in the business. I've put on every single hat. I've edited videos, I've edited podcasts, I've edited book review content, and everything in between. Booked people on podcasts, managed social accounts. And so like I mentioned it before, Kevin Horsley, author of Unlimited Memory, he's like, yeah, I like Tim's process of automate, delegate, and eliminate, but you have to optimize it first. You have to wear that hat. You have to truly understand the process, optimize it to the best of your ability, and then hand it off to somebody else or to a piece of technology or eliminate it. So that's elimination, automation, or delegation. And I feel like I've just, over the years, I've just been forced to get really good at that. The only thing that's left in the entire ecosystem of these businesses that I'm really responsible for is selling, because I love it and I don't want to give it up. And I guess book reviews as well. I've made a number of attempts at removing my face from our Instagram, but we just haven't been successful at that yet. So that's definitely going to happen down the line, because I don't want to be the bottleneck. I'd love for these businesses to just operate without me involved at all.
Nick, what was the process of writing your book? Like, when did you start? How long did it take? How many revisions did you have to go through? Were you able to use ChatGPT to help you out in any way? Tell us about the whole process and journey.
I was approached in 2021 by a self-publishing services company called Book Launchers, very close to BookThinkers, Book Launchers. They had been referring some business over to me for book reviews. So a self-publishing services company is pay to play. So you keep the rights to your book, you're self-publishing, but you're paying for the professional experience of developmental editing, the whole 9 yards, all the way through the marketing and distribution of your book. So you get the A-list treatment of a traditional publisher, but you get to keep the IP, meaning instead of the traditional publisher 90-10 relationship where they keep 90 and you only get 10 and you lose all creative control, you get to retain all of that. So anyway, that was 2 years ago. I was living in Medellin, Colombia, and they said, hey, if you ever want to write a book, we'll give you our suite of services in exchange for an ad in the back of the book that says, hey, if you like this book, come check out our services. And I said, I've always wanted to write a book. I think I could empathize with my clients a little bit better if I could write a book. And then I just started thinking about it. What would it be? What would it be on? What would it be like? Oof. After a lot of reflection, I decided it would be on how to retain and implement more from the books you're reading, because that's the primary problem that my customers, my audience, my reading audience is coming to me with. And I bought a bunch of books on reading. I bought a bunch of books on writing. I devoured all of them, and then I started. And it was an off and on process for almost like 2 years. It would consistently fall lower and lower on the priority list as my business continued to grow and expand, and I continued to work with more people and more dollars were kind of flowing across the screen. But I would always work on it a little bit here, a little bit there. I wasn't as disciplined as I wanted to be initially. And yeah, you know what? Because I was working with this company, Book Launchers, they would hold me accountable to working on it. They would do all of the editing, the revisions, the design, the layout. Like they did all the dirty work, which was great. And I think that made the process a little bit easier for me, especially over the last couple of months. Like there are 1,000 little things that happen behind the scenes, such as registering ISBN numbers, getting your book in the Library of Congress, like all these little things, Amazon listings and descriptions that you don't think about. And they took care of all of that. So it's a big, big thank you to Book Launchers. If you're somebody who's interested in writing a book, I would check them out. And did I use ChatGPT? Well, I started the process far before ChatGPT came out. By the time that it came out, I was supposed to submit my book for the official revisions. So what I did was I pulled up my first chapter, like, and the introduction, and I started throwing it into ChatGPT. And I would say things like, hey, please rewrite this and simplify it, with a more upbeat tone or whatever. I tried 1,000 different prompts, and I would go through different paragraphs and have ChatGPT improve them. And I did that for like the intro and for the first couple of pages, maybe, of the first chapter. And then I thought, you know what? I'm losing a little bit of me here. Like, yes, it might be more grammatically correct. It might read more efficiently, but it's losing a little bit of me. So I undid a bunch of those changes and I just gave them the book as it was. I left a couple changes in there just so that I could say, yes, ChatGPT and artificial intelligence did help me write this book, but it played less than a 1% role, as it should. I think people should go through the process of writing their own book because it's an expression of self-development and you learn a lot about yourself in that process. Don't take the shortcut. That'd be my advice.
You have a great memory, Nick. Like, I think when I asked multi-part questions, you would give a long answer to the first part and you would remember the second question I asked. You have a great memory.
Thank you.
Nick,
Practice.
where can people find your book that's going to be launched? And where are the best places for people to connect with you, learn more about what we've chat today, and basically just follow you and your journey?
Great questions. So you can find the book on Amazon as well as most major online retailers. It launches November 1st. I think this conversation will come out after November 1st. So check on Amazon, check on your favorite online retailer. You can also go to riseofthereaderbook.com. That site will be live and have a bunch of information on the book. You can also check out BookThinkers.com. That's our website. And the BookThinkers Instagram. I mean, that's where I'm most responsive. That's where I'm most active. You'll get new book recommendations on a daily basis. You'll see the interviews that we're conducting with really cool authors. And you'll also just get to ask book recommendations, learn from me, back and forth. So those are the places to go.
Thank you so much for your time today, Nick. I had so much fun. I love how sort of transparent, honest, sharing you are, and you're sort of really, down to earth, and you have that abundance mindset where you know that sharing the things that are working isn't going to take away from your success, but at the same time you're so open where you sort of share the things that haven't been working, and you don't have sort of any ego behind it, and that's sort of why I loved this conversation.
Well, thank you so much. It's the result of reading so many different perspectives, and maybe we can end with this. Reading is an extremely humbling experience because the more you learn, the less you actually know. For instance, maybe you'll read a book on the history of philosophy like I just did, and you'll learn all of these people that you didn't even know existed, and each one of them have books written about them, and all of these philosophies that you didn't know existed, and each one of those philosophies has hundreds of books written about them. And prior to picking up that book, I didn't know any of that existed. So yeah, I used to think I was a smart guy, and I've just consistently been humbled over and over and over and over and over again by all of the amazing people and useful information out there. So yeah, it's destroyed my ego, I think, in a very good way, in a healthy way, in a productive way. Yeah, so everybody go read something.
That's a great way to end it. Guys, if you made it this far, I just want to thank you for your time. Hopefully you guys got value from this amazing, beautiful episode. I'll see you guys next week. Peace.